Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting. The pattern of what can actually cause sulfite levels to increase in the body.
Right.
We're going to be focusing on one specific potential player and maybe a little bit of an unexpected one.
Yeah.
It's something called the NRF2 pathway,
Interesting.
and specifically when it's chronically activated.
Okay.
So it's really fascinating how different parts of our biology are connected.
Yeah, that's
Things
actually
you wouldn't expect to impact each other actually do.
right.
And that's kind of what we're going to explore today.
Exactly. And it's really important to understand this because elevated sulfite can have some pretty significant impacts on your health.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So to really get into this, we've pulled together a few different research articles.
Yeah.
We've got this really detailed case study of someone with really, really late onset sulfite oxidase deficiency.
Wow.
And then we've got a study that looks at deficiencies of ETH1 and MOCS1, and then a paper that really goes deep on the connection between a molecule called S-sulfocysteine and the nerve damage that happens in molybdenum cofactor deficiency.
Interesting.
And then finally, just a case report on a newborn who had really, really severe early molybdenum cofactor deficiency.
Wow. Okay.
So we've got a lot to cover today.
Yeah, we've got a pretty wide range of perspectives here to consider.
Right, exactly.
So our main goal today is going to be trying to weave these findings together
Right,
to try to understand what are the mechanisms that could actually lead to an increase in sulfite.
right.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at that NRF2 pathway
Yeah.
and what happens when it's just kind of constantly switched on.
Yeah.
So I guess let's just start with the basics.
Okay.
What is sulfite?
Yeah.
And why should we be worried if the levels are too high in the body?
Right. So sulfite is just this natural byproduct.
Okay.
It comes up when your body breaks down an amino acid called cysteine.
Okay.
And normally there's a really efficient system in place to kind of deal with this, right?
Right.
So there's an enzyme called sulfite oxidase,
Okay.
and it lives in this really specific compartment within your cells
Uh-huh.
called the mitochondrial intermembrane space,
Okay.
which is a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
But basically it takes sulfite and it converts it to sulfate.
Okay.
Now, sulfate is way less toxic.
Good.
And actually, your body needs it for a bunch of different things.
Interesting.
So you can kind of think of this as a detoxification step.
Oh, okay.
Like your cells have a way to take sulfite,
Right. Right.
which is not so great,
Yeah.
and turn it into sulfate, which is actually useful.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like a little cellular waste disposal system.
Right, exactly.
So what happens if that system isn't working the way it should?
Right.
You mentioned earlier that sulfite oxidase needs something called the molybdenum cofactor to work.
Yeah,
Or MACO for short.
exactly,
So
Mocha.
what does that do?
So sulfite oxidase can't actually function without that molybdenum cofactor.
Okay.
It's absolutely essential for its activity.
Got
And so if the sulfite doesn't get efficiently converted into sulfate,
it. Right.
it starts to build up, and that's when you start to see those health consequences.
Okay, so that's where the problems start.
Yeah, and our sources here really highlighted like a whole range of problems
Mm.
associated with too much sulfite.
Okay, so break it down for us. Like, what kind of health issues are we talking about?
So in that case, report about the newborn with molybdenum cofactor deficiency.
Okay.
The neurological damage they saw was so similar to what you see in a baby who didn't get enough oxygen at birth.
Wow.
So that kind of gives you a sense of how severe it can be.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty serious.
Yeah, and then the case study on late onset sulfite oxidase deficiency, they talked about some specific things you can see in brain imaging.
Okay.
So they saw signal changes in areas like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum,
Okay.
and even some underdevelopment of the vermis, which is part of the cerebellum that's really important for coordination.
Wow.
They talked about this increased brightness or hyperintensity in the MRI scans in regions like the globus pallidus and substantia nigra and dentate nucleus.
Okay.
It's a lot of names.
Yeah, there are a lot of very specific regions of the brain.
Right. But basically, across all these studies, what they're seeing is damage in the brain areas to control movement and coordination
Right.
and just overall neurological function when sulfite levels are high.
Okay, so that's really concerning. What did the other studies tell us?
So the study on ETH1 and MoCo deficiencies, they emphasized that when those systems aren't working properly,
Okay.
you get this buildup of toxic compounds.
Right.
And it causes really severe and progressive neurological problems.
Wow.
And they also saw elevated lactate in the brain in MoCo deficiency.
Interesting.
And actually, the newborn case report, they mentioned elevated lactate in the blood, too.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
And then both the ETH1 LMO CS1 paper and the paper on S-sulfocysteine pointed out that molybdenum cofactor deficiency can lead to seizures
Yeah.
and encephalopathy, which is basically a progressive decline in brain function.
Hmm.
And a lot of times, death in early childhood.
That's really sad.
Yeah, and the ETHA1 almost CS1 paper listed out some potential signs to watch for.
Okay.
Like if you see floppiness in the trunk, but increased stiffness in the limbs in a baby, or they're not gaining weight and growing like they should,
Yeah.
and even this condition called ectopia lentis, where the lens of the eye is displaced.
Wow.
So those are all potential red flags.
So basically what we're seeing here is that high sulfite levels, often because of problems with sulfite oxidase,
Right.
or its little helper molecule, MUCO, are really bad news,
Yeah.
especially early in life, but not necessarily only early in life, right?
Right, and that's what's so interesting about that late onset case.
Yeah.
It shows that these problems can actually emerge much later.
Yeah.
And they even referenced another study that talked about the possibility of a metabolic crisis after even just a minor head injury in these people.
Oh, wow.
So that's something to think about.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah, it really highlights how important this pathway for detoxifying sulfite is, like throughout our entire lifespan.
For sure.
Not just when we're babies.
Right, so we've established that too much sulfite is a serious problem.
Definitely.
So let's shift gears a little bit to that NRF2 pathway that we mentioned at the beginning.
Okay.
So what is that pathway and what normally causes it to become activated?
Okay, so think of the NRF2 pathway like the main defense system in your cells.
Okay.
Like it's this master switch that gets flipped on
Okay.
when your cells are under stress,
Right.
especially oxidative stress,
Okay.
which is basically when you have this imbalance between the harmful free radicals being produced
Hey.
and your body's ability to neutralize them.
Okay, that makes sense.
So when cells sense that there's too much stress going on,
Okay.
this protein called NRF2 gets stabilized
Yeah.
and it moves into the nucleus of the cell, which is like the control center.
Okay.
And once it's inside, it binds to specific regions of the DNA
Right.
and turns on the expression of all these protective genes.
Interesting.
So those genes then produce antioxidant enzymes and other proteins
Okay.
that can help to restore balance and protect the cell from damage.
So it sounds like a really good thing, this NRF2 pathway.
Yeah, in the short term, it's beneficial. It helps cells deal with temporary stress.
Okay, so then why are we focusing on chronic activation as a potential problem?
Right, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
So short bursts of NRF2 activation are good,
Okay.
but when it's chronically activated,
Yeah.
like constantly on for a long time,
Right.
that's when you start to see some unintended consequences. Now, our specific sources today, they don't really go into detail about what could cause this chronic NRF2 activation.
Right.
We're talking about sulfite.
Yeah.
But we know from other research that there are a lot of different things that can keep NRF2 turned on for too long.
Okay.
So what we're really interested in here is what happens downstream
Yeah.
when NRF2 is chronically active and how that might be connected to this increased sulfite production.
Okay, so we're kind of considering the possibility that if NRF2 is constantly on,
Yeah,
it could lead to higher sulfite levels, even if it's not a direct connection.
exactly.
So how does increased import of cysteine play into all this?
Okay, so this is where we start to connect a couple different processes.
Okay.
And it's not explicitly stated in these particular sources
No,
as like
yeah.
the main focus.
Yeah.
But there's evidence out there that there's this link between chronic NRF2 activation
Okay.
and increased uptake of certain amino acids into the cell.
Right.
And one of those is cysteine.
Okay.
Now, cysteine is a precursor to cysteine,
Right.
which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's the amino acid that gets broken down to produce sulfite.
Right. Right.
So if the cell's like, oh my gosh, we're under attack,
Yeah.
and it keeps those defense mechanisms in overdrive
Right.
because of this long-term NRF2 activation,
Okay.
it might start ramping up the import of the building blocks it needs for those protective pathways.
Right.
And one of those building blocks could be cysteine.
So the cell is basically stocking up on supplies.
Exactly. It's like preparing for battle.
I got it.
And sometimes that can have unintended consequences.
So if the cell is constantly taking in more cysteine because NRF2 is always on,
Right.
it makes sense that there would be more cysteine available
Yeah.
to get metabolized and therefore more sulfite produced?
Exactly. More cysteine inside the cell means more cysteine can be broken down.
Right.
And potentially that leads to a higher baseline level of sulfite production.
It's like you're constantly feeding the pathway that makes sulfite.
Right. Exactly.
And then we have to remember sulfite oxidase and its dependence on MOCO.
Right. That's key.
So even a small increase in sulfite, if your body can't process it effectively,
Yeah.
because of those MUCO or sulfite oxidase issues,
Right.
could lead to that buildup and all those health problems we talked about.
Exactly. And that study on ETH1 and MOCS1 deficiencies,
Yeah.
they were very clear that mutations in the genes that are involved in making MOCO,
Okay.
specifically MOCS1, MOCS2, and GPHN,
Okay.
those all lead to molybdenum cofactor deficiency.
Right. Or MOCD.
Right, MOCD. And that means that sulfite oxidase just can't do its job.
Right.
So even normal or slightly elevated sulfite production becomes a problem.
Right, because it builds up.
Exactly. And that case report about the newborn,
Yeah.
they actually found a specific mutation in the MOCS2 gene in that baby.
Oh, wow.
So that confirmed the diagnosis.
And it's not just a lack of MOCO that can cause issues.
Right, exactly.
That late onset case study we talked about focused on a new variant in the SUOX gene.
Right.
So what's so important about that one?
Well, the SUOX gene is the one that provides the instructions for making the sulfite oxidase enzyme itself.
Oh, okay.
So even if you have enough MOCO,
Right.
if there's a problem with the enzyme because of a mutation in SUOX, it can lead to isolated sulfite oxidase deficiency.
So it's like a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Either the enzyme itself isn't working. Right.
Or it doesn't have that crucial cofactor it needs.
Exactly. You need both a functional enzyme
Right.
and the cofactor MOCO to manage the sulfite levels.
Okay, so this really highlights how important MOCO is.
Yeah.
So our outline then asks about how MOCO is actually produced.
Yeah.
Like, what are the precursors and cofactors involved?
Right. So creating MOCO is this really complex multi-step process.
Oh, bad.
It happens inside the cell, and it starts with a molecule called GTP.
Okay.
And then through a whole series of enzymatic reactions,
Right.
GTP gets converted into a molecule called CPMP,
Oh, right.
which is short for cyclic pyranopterin monophosphate.
Catchy.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But that's a crucial intermediate.
Okay.
And then through even more steps, the molybdenum atom gets incorporated,
Right.
and sulfur atoms are added, and you finally end up with the mature functional MOCO.
Wow, so it's a whole big process.
It's a whole orchestrated thing,
Yeah.
really tightly regulated, involving all these different enzymes and specific conditions inside the cell. So are there any known factors that can kind of limit or affect that MACO production?
Okay.
Because our outline specifically mentions things like glutathione,
Yeah.
and same in the mitochondria,
Right.
and also vitamin B6, copper, and zinc.
So this is where we got to be careful about saying these are like definitive rate-limiting steps in MACO production,
Okay.
just based on what these papers are telling us.
Right.
But the ETH1 and MOCS1 deficiency paper does give us some interesting context
Okay.
because it talks about disturbances in the redox balance
Yeah.
inside the cells of people with these deficiencies,
Okay.
including reduced levels of glutathione.
Right, which is an important antioxidant.
Exactly. And even though glutathione might not be a direct precursor in the MACO synthesis pathway itself,
Okay.
this disrupted redox environment can definitely affect the enzymes that are involved in that multi-step process.
Right, so it's not a direct effect, but it could be an indirect effect.
Exactly. It's all about the cellular environment. And then with vitamin B6, copper, and zinc, those are all important cofactors in lots of different metabolic pathways.
Yeah.
But again, our sources don't explicitly say they're direct limiting factors for MOCO production.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that having optimal levels of all those nutrients
Right.
is going to be important for overall cellular health
Right.
and keeping those metabolic pathways running smoothly.
So it's all about balance again.
Exactly. And then there's that interesting finding from the S-sulfocysteine paper
Yeah.
about depleted plasma cysteine levels in those MOCD patients,
Right.
which really highlights how interconnected sulfur metabolism is.
Right.
Like if you have a serious defect in one area, it can have ripple effects elsewhere.
Right, it's all connected.
Exactly.
So even though we can't say for sure if those specific factors directly limit MOCO production,
Right.
it seems like the overall cellular environment, and especially that redox state that involves glutathione, probably plays a role in how efficiently MOCO can be made.
Right. And disruptions like the one seen in ETH1 or MOCS1 deficiencies.
Right.
Those can create a cascade of problems
Yeah.
that could affect how well MOCO is produced or used.
Wow. So let's try to put this all together.
Okay.
We've seen that elevated sulfite can cause all sorts of health problems,
Right.
and that chronic activation of the NRF2 pathway might lead to increased cysteine import.
Yeah.
And that could mean more sulfite production.
Exactly.
And then if you have problems with MOCO or the sulfite oxidase enzyme itself,
Right.
your body can't detoxify that extra sulfite effectively.
Right. And it just builds up.
So this really highlights that connection between something like NRF2 activation,
Yeah.
which seems like it's way upstream,
Right.
and these downstream metabolic consequences.
Exactly.
It's really amazing how it's all connected.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
It is.
And it's like that protective switch being stuck on
Yeah.
might accidentally push other pathways in the wrong direction,
Yeah.
leading to things like increased sulfite production. And if the body's main way of dealing with that sulfite is broken
Yeah.
because of those genetic defects, you get the accumulation and all the health issues that we've talked about.
Yeah, and it's not just academic either, right?
Right, yeah.
Like understanding these pathways can be really important for actually developing treatments.
Exactly.
That ETH1 MOMOCS1 paper even talked about a mitochondrial targeted antioxidant called JP4039.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
That showed some promising results in the lab.
Yeah, in those ETH1 and MOCS1 deficient cells,
Right.
it seemed like it helped.
So even researching these rare conditions
Yeah,
can give us insights into these broader biological mechanisms
definitely.
and maybe even lead to therapies that could be used for more common conditions too.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into sulfite metabolism,
Yeah.
what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's just incredible to think about all these interconnected metabolic pathways.
Yeah.
And how something seemingly unrelated might have this huge impact on something as basic as sulfite balance.
Right.
Like, what about other cellular signaling pathways?
Yeah.
Or the environmental factors we're exposed to? Or even just the bacteria in our gut?
Right.
All of those things could be influencing these delicate balances.
It's kind of humbling
It really is.
to realize how much we don't know.
Yeah, and how complex it all is.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate the bigger picture
Definitely.
and how our bodies work as a whole system
Exactly.
to maintain health.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is. Well, this has been another amazing deep dive.
It has.
Thanks for joining us today,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See you later.